Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Invest in Africa and DIT webinar, along with Standard Chartered Bank, to discuss the Africa Free Trade Agreement. You're very welcome to this morning or this afternoon's session. We have an incredible panel for you, which I think is reflected in the fact that we have over 1,800 of you registered for today. Nearly 2,000 people have shown an interest in today's panel. And the good news is we're looking for a discussion. So there's not going to be any speeches, no presentations. We're going to jump straight into the panel in a minute, but please submit questions on the chat. Given there's nearly 2,000 of you, we of course unlikely to get to all of them, but we will pick themes and the top questions and put those to the panelists from about 1 o'clock onwards. So we're leaving plenty of time for your questions. The only house rule is we're trying to keep this a COVID-free space as best possible, which is all about the future and opportunities and the excitement and possibilities that the free trade agreement represents. And we'd like to leave 2020 behind as much as possible. Now, of course, the C word frames almost every discussion, so it's bound to come up. But let's try and keep this future focused, optimistic, and around possibilities and opportunities. Clearly, there will be challenges associated too, but as best possible, a C word free space. My name is William. I'm the Program Director, William Pollen, for Invest in Africa. We're an organization with presence across African countries, and our purpose and raison d'etre is all about building local capacity and domestic champions and building up the capabilities and competitiveness of typically SMEs across Africa, but some of those are more M than S, so medium-sized businesses, and helping them access markets, understand how to do business, access finance, and genuinely grow and go on to become domestic and regional players. So the vision and idea behind the free trade agreement is like all our Christmases have come at once. It's exactly what we stand for and exactly what we believe in. So we hope that the thousands of SMEs that we work with will be well positioned to benefit from the free trade agreement. With our support, we work with donor institutions and corporates who face challenges in getting their supply chains ready to make the most of opportunities like the free trade agreement. So for us, it's right at the heart of what we stand for and what we do. So we're massively excited about it. And you can find out lots more about our work on Invest in Africa website. For now, though, we're going to jump straight into this brilliant panel and let's really unpack the opportunity that is the free trade agreement. How will it work in reality? How will it be implemented? And what does it mean for you? Practical examples for you as people running businesses. What difference can we expect to see in the coming months? I think it's important we recognize it's a huge continental-wide agreement that's going to take months, if not years, to settle in. We shouldn't be expecting huge successes as of January this year, or massive change necessarily, especially with what's happened last year. So let's be patient, let's be positive, and let's get started. So I'm going to hand you over to our moderator, Omar, and he's going to guide you through the session today. But thank you all for joining, your time, and please do get your questions submitted.
Thank you, William. Thank you, everyone, wherever you may be. As William says, we are Afro-optimists. In my particular position, they say the media is generally pessimistic, but in my organization, so where we publish African Business and New African, we've always been Africa Optimist and Africa Files, whereby all our eggs are in the African nest. So we need to make a success of all our African initiatives. So I'm delighted to have a diverse panel, which is always great. So hopefully we'll get lots of different opinions, different insights. But we'll start first with His Excellency Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Ambassador Albert Muchanga. First of all, Albert, a couple of things. Congratulations. You're on mute, by the way, but congratulations for getting to where you got to. It was no mean feat. The odds were against you in some respects, especially with last year, and it's not often that we can say that a deadline has to some extent been met, and despite all the skeptics, you managed to get agreement and a lot of momentum. So first of all, how are you feeling?
Thank you very much. I think we did it because there was a lot of very high political commitments from the heads of state and government. When the ministers of trade in 2012 recommended to have a program of action on boosting intra-African trade, they already agreed here in Addis Ababa, and we undertook 3 years of preparations, and in 2015, we were able to launch the negotiations in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we're told to finalize the negotiations by 2017. And we did just that. We concluded virtually all the negotiations in December 2017. And in March 2017, when I came aboard, one of the initiatives we undertook was to have one of the heads of state and government appointed by his peers as the lead and champion of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this is the president of His Excellency, Mr. Yusuf Mohammed. Now, when we were in Niamey, there were a lot of difficulties, but he was able to have a caucus of ministers who were attending the negotiation. And he told them very, very clearly that he was not going to go to Addis Ababa to report that the negotiations were not concluded. And the ministers, it took about 3 hours to go through the drafts prepared by the senior trade officials, and they cleared. So he was able to come to Addis Ababa with a very, very positive report that only a few fine-tuning issues needed to be finalized, and we needed the ministers of justice and legal affairs to go through the text to ensure that it was legally in order. And the president of Ghana said, this is a very historic moment. We should not lose momentum. So instead of waiting for July to sign the agreement, let's have a special summit, an extraordinary summit. And it was agreed upon for 21st March in 2018 in Rwanda, Kigali. At that time, Rwanda was the chairperson of the African Union. And at that special summit, a record 44 countries signed the agreement. And after that, the next step was ratification. A lot of parties came to us to say, you're not going to be lucky this time around. We give you about 5 years for the agreement to be ratified, because that's the trend in the African Union system. And we said, well, we'll see what we can do. So we worked together with the president of Nigeria, reaching out to member states to ensure that we had the ratifications as soon as possible. And within a month, we had close to 5 ratifications. And the minimum number of ratifications required for the agreement to enter in force is 22. 22, yeah. And that number was attained towards the end of April 2019, which was a period of about 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day after signing the agreement. And it entered into force on the 31st May 2019. So there was a lot of political commitment, and there was a lot of development and transformational leadership being applied to ensure that the peers could buy in. And as we stand now, we've got 54 countries that have signed on into the agreement, and we've got 35 ratifications. The 35th year ratification is from Malawi, which was deposited not too long ago. And right now, I've got firm assurances from Zambia, Tanzania, Somalia, Algeria, and Morocco that they, in due course, be depositing instruments of ratification. So that's how we did it. Strong political commitment.
Fantastic. So, and it's great to have that historical context, actually. And you spoke about political will and leadership. But really, what we're interested in now is what next. So, what do we need to do next to make sure that it's a success? So really, in terms of political leadership, ultimately, we want goods to freely trade across borders. But we need to make sure that the paperwork is easy to administer. We need to make sure that the teams at the border controls know how to administer the paperwork for the goods to flow freely and at a minimal cost. So what's next? So the political leadership has done its bit. So what are the next steps?
The next step, they already some of the steps are already in place. We need a dedicated secretariat, and it's in place. The Secretary General is Mr. Bamukele Mene from South Africa. He has been posted for close to a year now, and work is underway to recruit staff. And as a starting point, there are secondments from member states and other parties. So the first step is to have a dedicated secretariat. And the assembly, when we met in December last year, said in order to align implementation and negotiations, so even the negotiations should move over to Accra. So we have facilitated that. And that's why I'm now in a position where I'm taking a low key. I don't want to talk a lot about the African Continental Free Trade because we have a dedicated secretariat. Now, the secretariat has to undertake a number of measures. They have to, and they've already done that. They've met with the customs officials. We talked about paperwork to ensure that there's a very good flow of paperwork. Work is underway at the secretariat to come up with a dispute settlement mechanism, which will initially be a table. Eventually, it will go grow into an institution. Then, as part of the preparatory activities, we have what we call the online monitoring, reporting, and the elimination mechanism for non-tariff barriers. Because in some cases, you may eliminate tariffs, but the non-tariff barriers come into force and they continue fragmenting the market instead of defragmenting it. So these are some of the measures that we are undertaking. We know that there is no template for implementation of this agreement. It's the first time in Africa that we have a continent-wide agreement. In the past, continuing, we have regional economic communities. There's experience there. But at the continental level, there has been nothing of this sort. So we are going to learn from what our colleagues and we are doing as we go along, and try to learn from experience. But part of the package, when you look at intra-African trade, a great majority of intra-African trade is within regions, so intra-regional trade. So the task for the Secretariat now is to promote inter-regional trade so that we've got continent-wide trade. And to this end, our colleagues in Ghana are in discussion with the regional economic communities to facilitate inter-regional trade. So those are some of the activities that are underway.
Okay, fantastic. And look, when I talk to the private sector, I don't want to say too often, but occasionally they say to me that they haven't necessarily been consulted, or they don't necessarily know what the advantages are going to be from their perspective in terms of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So what's your message to the private sector, and how do we get the private sector because ultimately they're the main beneficiaries. This is who it's done for. It's for the private sector and the 99%, not the 1% like ourselves who understand what the dynamics are. But how do we get them engaged and to take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I don't know which segment of the private sector you are talking about, because it's very large. Immediately, we started the process of negotiating this agreement, and actually immediately the agreement was signed. Quite a number of private sector entities came forward to enter into memorandum of understanding with us. We have the Afro Champions initiatives in Accra, Ghana, who are interested in promoting continent-wide investments. The manufacturers came together to form the African Manufacturers Association, actually they call it Pan-African Manufacturers Association, PAMA. Then building on the regional business councils, the private sector again came forward to establish the African Business Council. That is the first step. So then over and above that, starting in March 2018, we have on the eve of the summits been organizing the African Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum. And we have invited the private sector from, not just from Africa, but from all over the world. Some have responded, others have not yet responded. Then in addition to that, we've teamed up with the African Export-Import Bank to start the Inter-African Trade Fair, bringing together business people from all over the world. And I think the UK was represented at the inaugural fair, which was held in Cairo, Egypt. And the next one is going to be held this year in September. And over 1,000 exhibitors attended there. So it will be very interesting to know who are the members of the private sector saying they have not been consulted. Then at the national level, some governments have set up national committees, and in those national committees on the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's representation from the private sector.
Omar, I don't know whether it's okay for me to just jump in for a minute, just to, and coming from the private sector as well as an executive of Afro Champions, to confirm what His Excellency has said, and to also add that as late as November 2019, we gathered all the business associations of the countries which had ratified and worked with the AU and CODA, that's a coalition for dialogue in Africa, and met in Addis and had a 3-day consultative meeting with them on the CFTA. And following that, in January last year, Afro Champions organized another meeting of all the private sector in Africa in Accra, at which His Excellency was represented by the Director of Trade. So a lot is going on in various private sector organizations, and in agreement with him that the private sector has been widely consulted.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to have one last question to Your Excellency, if you don't mind. And it may be a little bit politically charged. I know that the AFCFTA, ultimately it's about increasing intra-Africa trade, so which is low compared to other regions, Europe, Asia, etc. So saying that, when I was speaking to, I won't say who it was, but to someone who works with international trade, they said that the AFCFTA will also be an opportunity for Africa to now negotiate as one continent, as opposed to each country negotiating bilaterally. And on that front, it's about changing the terms of trade for Africa, and therefore benefiting some African companies reaching out to international markets, as well as, to some extent, defending local industry within Africa. So is that going to, do you see that as a game changer as well, in terms of our bargaining power?
A lot of changes are going to take place as a result of the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think I'll answer that question by indicating that throughout the history of the independence of Africa, most of the investors were not too keen to invest in Africa because they regarded the markets being too small. And if they established in one African country, they would not be able to export to another African country because the transport and communication interlinkages were very, very weak, and there were a lot of tariff and non-tariff barriers. By creating the African Continental Free Trade Area, we're going to remove all that. And it's going to be complemented with a protocol on investment, a protocol on intellectual property rights, a protocol on competition policy, and a protocol on e-commerce and digital trade. So we're going towards deeper integration. Now, as we do that, there's also going to be a process of policy alignment, because increasingly a lot of countries are going to see that if they have to benefit more from the African Continental Free Trade Area, the national policies should be aligned to those of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And eventually, when we have the African Customs Union, then we are going to have a common external tariff. It is at that stage that it will be in a position ready to say each of the countries must commit to negotiating as one voice. There are provisions in the agreement for countries to undertake bilateral free trade agreement negotiations with the other parties. but the obligation is to report to the rest of the membership on the impact of that. But what I've been telling our interlocutors is that as much as you like bilateral free trade agreements, what actually is at stake is whether to maintain the process of fragmentation of African economies by ensuring the existence of national markets, or to contribute to the process of defragmenting their markets so that we have a larger market space which can attract long-term and larger scale investments. So this is the discussion that is underway. But the process where we are now going to really say we've negotiated as one voice is when we have the customs union, which is another stage to be reached. But politically, there's already commitment with the African Union that when we engage with the rest of the world, Africa must speak with one voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So next I'd like to go to the UK Trade Envoy, Emma Wade-Smith. She's one of, whenever I've seen her, she's always been a champion for Africa, a true globalist, and always flying the African flag and trying to, I suppose, create links in terms of the UK and Africa, but ultimately making sure that investment is contributing in a positive manner to African development. But first of all, tell us a little bit about last week. You held a very successful summit, as we were discussing in the green room, and sort of the take homes from last week as well.
Yeah, thank you, Omar, and good afternoon, everybody. I mean, I'd look to say that our Africa Investment Conference last week was a continuation of the UK Africa Investment Summit that we held in person, if anyone remembers doing that all those months ago in London, really to bring together African and UK government and business leaders to really emphasize the importance of getting more investment to come into Africa to support African innovation, African entrepreneurs, to help to grow African businesses, and to bring together actually the inspiration that we see across the African continent and across the UK, solving problems, growing businesses, creating jobs. And what we saw last week was the virtual manifestation of that. The positive about virtual, I think, is that it does give us much greater reach. And so we were able to see many more people at that event from across the African continent and from across the United Kingdom. So a real positive to be able to be much more inclusive in an online environment. But the fundamental message was absolutely the same as last year, which is that we as the United Kingdom government are absolutely committed to supporting more UK investment flow into Africa. We have our public sector investment through the likes of CDC, our Development Finance Institute, which is, has been demonstrating over the last year its complete commitment to the African continent, and to use that patient capital to really inspire more private sector investment flows as well. A good example of what CDC has been doing really over the last year is really leaning into this counter-cyclical piece to help bring more liquidity into the companies that it's supported across Africa. And they are also pivoting, as we're seeing so many investment vehicles doing, to really support the rebuilding of economies in a more sustainable, inclusive and resilient fashion. So we've got exciting times ahead as we see some of that public sector investment really manifesting itself across the African continent. And of course, what we're seeing in the private sector, it's been a tough old year for investment, but certainly the £15.4 billion worth of deals that we announced at last year's summit, we were so pleased this year to be able to confirm that they are all still live. None of those has dropped away as a result of the challenges that companies have faced over the last year. And so, that real spread of investment across different African countries, across sectors, really breaking out of the shackles of mining and oil and gas, moving really into renewables and agriculture and supporting some of this exciting technology transformation that we're seeing across the continent. The big difference for us this year was a very strong focus on business to business. So last year, you know, we wanted to create this sense of this is government and business together, but we wanted to create a very strong platform for business to talk to business about what it's like to do business in Africa. That's a lot of business going on just in that one sentence. But the point is that, you know, as a government representative, you know, I may not be the voice that a business needs to hear from to convince them to take that leap and go and explore a market in Africa to export to import from, to invest in. And so really bringing you know, the real voice of business, those companies that are active on the continent, those companies that are in partnership together across Africa, across the UK, to inspire more people to take that leap and to explore. And of course, our message was, we as the UK government have a whole network of people across the African continent to support businesses that are looking to grow, looking for investment, and looking to invest. So it was a terrific opportunity to reinforce all of those messages.
Thank you, Commissioner. So sorry, Trade Envoy, sorry. The Commissioner said, he spoke about scale ultimately. AFCFTA gives scale, and investors are looking for scale. And ultimately, from a political side, there's a regulatory and administrative that has been overcome or is being overcome, as well as obviously the trade dispute system, courts, etc., settlements, etc. But one point that you discussed last week, I believe, at the conference, was you also need infrastructure ultimately. So trade doesn't happen without infrastructure to move goods around. And I believe you spoke a little bit about how we can build that infrastructure, invest in that infrastructure, and ultimately the UK is pretty good in terms of the capital raising and also the courts, the legal and financial services that accompany infrastructure investments or that are necessary for infrastructure investments. But another aspect that's very interesting, especially that we've seen with, unfortunately, I've got to mention it, with COVID, is ultimately dependency on a strong health system, but also pharmaceutical industry. I know that the health sciences are something that are very important for the UK, where the UK's got a competitive advantage. But in terms of developing a strong pharmaceutical sector on the continent, is there anything that you heard from last week's conference that may be of interest for us?
Well, look, I would encourage anyone who's watching today who didn't get a chance to see the really fascinating conversations last week to follow me on LinkedIn, and I can provide the links to sort of see all of those wonderful people talking about a whole range of things: infrastructure, renewables, financial and professional services, agriculture and agri-tech, as well as really key driving forces for economic growth and job creation in Africa and the UK. In terms of healthcare and life sciences, even before this last year, I'm trying to do everything to avoid saying the word, but even before this last year, we knew that healthcare and life sciences was a really key sector for the UK in terms of our experience and our expertise, and also for the African continent in terms of the partnerships we can build, the investment opportunities we have. And certainly as I was traveling around the continent, as I used to do, was seeing where UK companies had invested, where we had factory manufacturing, production, and so on. But I was also hearing from governments about a really strong demand to see more, always wanting to see UK companies investing, building a factory locally to create that domestic production capability. And the challenge for companies has so often been the scale of the investment and the scale of the market that you can then access through that. And this is where I think, for me, one of the brilliant elements of this Continental Free Trade Area can really come into its own in creating those economies of scale. And I think that that will be a great attraction for a number of companies that are passionate about this continent, that want to expand their business, that want to create jobs locally by building local manufacturing and other capabilities, but frankly just can't make the numbers add up. And I think at the end of the day, we have to recognise that the private sector needs to make money, otherwise they stop existing. So I think for me, the Continental Free Trade Area provides a great opportunity for us to look across supply chains, to look across manufacturing capabilities, to look across national industrialization strategies, to really figure out actually how can we collectively bring a greater momentum to economic growth and diversification to Africa by working together and by cracking open the barriers, both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. And I see that really very clearly in the pharmaceutical, life sciences, healthcare sector.
Fantastic. And to be honest, I think that with last year's crisis, it showed that when we put our minds together, and the CDC has played a fantastic role, it shows that there is the scale. I mean, the CDC is securing 270 million doses of vaccines for the continent. So it shows that there is scale, and it makes the opportunity worthwhile for some of these bigger investors. And hopefully the FCFTA will turn this scale on paper a reality. Razia, we saw last week, I think it was last week, we saw Benin go to market, raise €1 billion on the Eurobond markets. A few days later, we saw the Bank for West African Development, BOAD, also raise €750 million. Last year in November, we saw Côte d'Ivoire come to market with, I believe, €1 billion or so. So the point is, we're seeing the government, the sovereigns, and also institutions successfully come back to the Eurobond markets. We feared that there wouldn't be any market appetite, but these bonds were oversubscribed. And from speaking to investment bankers out there, there is a lot of capital looking for higher yields, and the outlook from on the African side isn't as bad as we had feared maybe 3 or 6 months ago. So what's your outlook for the year ahead, and where do you see the opportunities?
Thank you, Omar. So there is a need to put into perspective a lot of what we have seen in the recent past. And William did say at the outset, let's not talk about COVID. Unfortunately, for an economist, it's such a big part, a driver of everything that has happened, that is still going to happen, that there's no way of avoiding it. Last year, with the onset of the COVID crisis, around March, April, with many different economies, both in developed countries and developing countries going into a lockdown, we know that we saw capital withdrawals from a lot of developing regions. There was a flight into safe havens, there was great market volatility, everyone was very concerned about what this would mean for the global economy, expectations that proved to be right, the worst peacetime slump in growth that we are likely to have seen since the Great Depression. Now, of course, a big part of what happened thereafter was the policy response. Very accommodative monetary policy, especially in developed economies, but in developing countries, across many different African countries as well, central banks lowering interest rates, making it easier for borrowers to refinance their obligations, putting in place different measures that I think there's some sound interference coming from the line. Hopefully I can talk over that.
I am get onto video, but at least I have the audio. So I will wait.
Go ahead, Razia.
Something unexpected. Well, the point of all of that was the fact that we have seen almost an unprecedented amount of central bank balance sheet expansion. Developed country central banks pumping in more liquidity into their economies, that looking for investment opportunities in the global economy. That is a big driver of what has changed for Africa. So you're absolutely right. There were big concerns last year. There was this period following on from Ghana's issuance early in the year, and then almost nothing until Cote d'Ivoire came to the market at the end of the year, that issuance being 5 times oversubscribed. But there were real fears at the time, would it be that much more difficult for African sovereigns to be able to tap international capital markets for borrowing? The answer right now seems to be not necessarily, but there is a need for a bigger, longer term perspective. And this is, we're still trying to size up what the COVID crisis is going to mean for the region's outlook. Last year, the narrative was very much that actually, thankfully, the health impact had not been anywhere nearly as negative as initially feared, but the economic effects of the crisis were going to be with us for some time. And in 2021, as we start the year with the second wave of COVID in many different countries, the need to find a means to accelerate growth in the longer term becomes even more important. This is where the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, simply because the liberalization of trade, that embrace of closer economic ties, is a great way of offsetting some of the economic headwinds that will have resulted from the crisis. African countries need every single growth driver that they can find. This may not produce results in the very near term. It would be wrong for anyone to think that come January the 1st, 2021, a lot changed for the region. But what we do know is that that embrace of closer regional integration will, over time, create the scope for scale, hopefully help to attract greater investment, and play an important role, a very important role in terms of not allowing the crisis that we've just been through to impact long-term development prospects very meaningfully. This is a needed stimulus, but of course we also know the drawbacks. You raised the issue of capital market access. One of the key concerns in terms of the actual challenges facing closer intra-regional integration, the integration of different economies in Africa, is that we just don't have the infrastructure in place to really make that trade very meaningful at the very outset. But we also know that as much as it's encouraging that different sovereigns can tap international capital markets, can tap the savings pools of the rest of the world, and Africa does still offer a much healthier return in that respect, it's also likely to be more expensive and more vulnerable to changes in market sentiment. Already in the US at the start of this year, there started to be talk of when there might be a need to taper the stimulus already put in place. Markets reacted to that. There is concern around a weaker growth profile on the other side of this crisis for many developing countries. And the concern then is how much debt carrying capacity do the different sovereigns really have? We could talk at length about this, but the long and short of it is there's going to be a need for reform. There's going to be a need to accelerate growth. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement can play an all-important role in preventing that permanent scarring, the permanent loss of capacity, the permanent closure of businesses, the permanent loss of jobs. It is important that everyone is focused on ensuring those gains to trade, but the backdrop in terms of what different economies have just been through, that just contributes to the challenge.
Thank you, Raja. So if anything, we need more urgency to make sure that we reap the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the larger trading area. A couple of questions in terms of, growth is driven, and African growth is driven as well. African growth is very diverse and is driven by many factors, but ultimately commodities have had a role to play, whether we like it or not. So do you see a resurgence in commodity prices and growth led by greater trade with China and India?
Well, one of the aspects of the global recovery as we see it now, and one of the very positive aspects for Africa, is that China's growth continued to be relatively robust. In the fourth quarter of 2020, China's growth surprised very positively. Notwithstanding the COVID crisis, China did achieve positive growth last year. And so commodity markets, like all financial markets being forward-looking, are pricing in the recovery already. For oil markets, all importantly, as soon as the news of successful tests of the vaccines were out, oil prices rallied, up $10 a barrel on that news alone. And this is looking forward to the likelihood of a recovery, the likelihood that global trade recovers, that this will create demand for commodities. It's fair to say that African economies are already benefiting. But as was raised earlier in this discussion, the point raised by His Excellency Albert Muchanga, which is a lot of the hurdle that African economies face is why are they still locked into this situation of being primary commodity producers? So the conversation about taking it forward isn't just, yes, it's relatively good news, there's a cyclical recovery, but it's about how to do a lot more with the prospects created by that recovery when it does happen.
Great. So, no, absolutely. I mean, economic diversification is critical, and I think it's a driver of the FCFTA as well. It's creating that local industry and transforming manganese or whatever it is, rather than exporting it to China to then re-import it. Absolutely. Maybe we'll go to David. I know David's been. So David's a lawyer based in Ghana and an entrepreneur, but I know he's been one of the champions, and he's been consulting with the AU or assisting them in terms of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and making it a reality. So I'm going to go back to the title of this particular session, which is the hopes and fears for businesses and investors. So from your perspective, we've reached D-Day, and we've managed to do it despite the skeptics and despite the challenges. So what are the fears and opportunities for businesses and investors that you're speaking to and that you're involved with, David?
Yeah, so thanks, Omar. So the fears are what I would call the traditional fears, and I can just reduce them into two. One is the skepticism around how the regional economic communities previously have not succeeded. If you take ECOWAS as an example, the challenges of the ECOWAS trade liberalization, closure of borders, etc. And these have happened in other regions as well. If you take East Africa, between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania, there are challenges on cross-border trade on some instances. The other one has to do with the physical ability to move goods because of lack of cross-border infrastructure, as well as the non-tariff barriers. So this is one set of category of the fears. The other set of category, which I'll put in the second group, is the famous lack of access to capital and cost of capital in order to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. So these traditional fears do exist. But having said that, there is a lot of hopeful sentiments on the ground. And there is one aspect of the whole CFTA agreement which is often lost on many, and which the organization on my nightlife, I work for the Afro Champions organization. I've worked with the AU and tried to push, which is the fact that before the AFCFTA, intra-Africa trade was already increasing. Actually, by 20 years ago, we were around 2% of trade. By 2019, we were already around 18% of trade. That's without the CFTA. And then there is the boosting intra-Africa trade regime that many countries are trying to implement. So what the CFTA has done is to actually raise the impetus at even a higher level. And there are two types of Africa that I see from where I sit advising businesses. There is Africa which gets reported in the news, which is what our heads of states talk about, which at times create the skepticism on the part of the private sector. Then there is the Africa below, which doesn't get talked about a lot, which is the young people who are exporting basic products across the continent already using Instagram and digital online systems, which are not necessarily getting recorded in the Trade Observatory. So these two types of Africa have to be recognized. One that has done with the advent of free trade is to create a new opportunity for people to be able to take advantage of this. And before I conclude on this, I think it's important we recognize what has happened or what will happen over the next 5 years with the AFCFTA. One is the FDI sector. And when you look at the FDI sector, the investors are looking at a bigger market. How do I tap into all the 55 countries? And AU talks about 55 countries, not 54. How do I tap into all the 55 countries on the continent? Cross-border issues and tariff barriers, etc. That's one issue for the FDIs and the multinationals. The other issue which doesn't get talked about very much is the SMEs in Africa, whose problem is different. That problem is how to take advantage of the AFCFTA, and then you find that their challenges relate to they don't understand the documentation system, the certificate of origin, where do they go to, etc. This is where business associations and the secretariat come in very handy. Then in that same scale, there is a confusion between these SMEs. Everybody thinks the SMEs should behave like multinationals and FDIs. There's a need to upscale. No, one of the things I keep emphasizing that we should distinguish upscaling from upgrading, because if we encourage SMEs to upgrade and develop good quality products in accordance with the standards, because AFCFTA is also coming with other collateral protocols, including the standards protocol. If they do that, a new opportunity emerges, which is the opportunity of aggregators and consolidators of goods, which can enter into this larger market and also integrate it among the supply chain. So we should look at the AFCFTA just beyond an agreement that creates opportunity for multinationals, but for bringing the SMEs also up the scale into the value chain and as it were moving people out of poverty.
Tell me, in terms of your clients and their understanding of the AFCFTA, what would you say that's like? There's a good understanding, they're positioning themselves to take advantage of it, or it's a wait and see approach?
No, so let me relate to a study that we have just been part of in helping one DFI conduct into 8 countries in Africa, covering 3 in North Africa, 2 in West Africa, 2 in East Africa, and 1 in Southern Africa. The interesting revelation is that 100% of all the entities you speak to do know about the AFCFTA, do know about its positive sides. But when you ask them the question as to how prepared are they to take advantage of it, only 45% are preparing to take advantage of it over the next 5 years. And why is that? And the explanation is the skepticism one, and the ability to take advantage, which is the other. So in one segment of our clients are positioning themselves to take advantage. Another segments just don't know what to do. What governments should be doing more and more is how to encourage that segment that doesn't know how to do, through business associations, etc., to understand what to do. And also to understand that with the fact of the rules of origin, it is important to encourage this category to be able to integrate more and more into the system. So I think it's quite a lot of opportunity, but it behoves on both private sector and public sector side to make sure that we don't leave one side out, which may then create a social backlash. So I think there's an opportunity to take advantage from all sides as well.
Fantastic. Look, we'll go to Giles next. So, Giles, you've heard from the commissioner and from your fellow speakers. We had a brief chat last week in terms of the AFCFTA. So, what's your take on it from the private sector's perspective? So, Giles heads the grains and oilseed trade at ETG, which is one of the biggest agribusiness companies on the continent.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. I think, I mean, obviously, as commodity traders, an African-wide free trade agreement has huge implications for us as a business. And obviously, because we're trading in agricultural commodities, that has a downward effect on staple food and food security in a lot of these countries. So, the free trade agreement has, potential seismic shift in the way African food moves, and that can take many different courses. And I think the devil will be in the details as to what tariffs are actually implemented at the end of the day. We know that there are a lot of protectionist policies around staple foods in a lot of these countries. So I'm sure that over the coming months and years, as Razia, mentioned, from an economist point of view, I think it's a longer term change that we're going to see instead of a sort of short term fix. And I think it's very exciting as long as there's an open dialogue between all the various actors. I think it's very positive for a business like us. And obviously, as a trader, we are believers in free movement of goods and people, efficient movement of goods and people, providing food from surplus to deficit areas, and where businesses can take advantages of arbitrage between different countries. And the free trade agreement, can potentially open up a lot more opportunities, especially in the food trade in Africa. I think we already see a fairly well-developed trade agreement structure between places like Kenya, who are exporters of high-value goods like flowers and vegetables, to like the EU. I think what is lacking is, the structured trade frameworks for intertrade of lower value commodities like maize, staple foods. And I think, this could open up a huge opportunity to put those in place to bring huge benefits to the supply chain. And I think the other advantage is that we all know that doing business in Africa is not always easy. And it's made even more difficult by having the various different trade agreements, COMESA, Sadiq, and so on. And by bringing in a continental-wide trade agreement, that could bring some simplicity, which could open up the market to new players, increase competition, and generally provide incentives to the private sector to become more involved in Africa. I think to this end, as we've seen recently, globally, agricultural commodity prices have been in the news quite recently. Very, very high prices recorded. People are linking it to the food crisis of 2008. And in 2008, we did see a huge increase in interest from investors in particularly food production in Africa. And I think this current ongoing situation could see, again, a second wave of interest from investors into Africa, particularly around food production. Food security is always a hot topic around development. And I think this could present a huge opportunity to investors and also to Africa to effectively have a second go at primary production investment in Africa, and securing food security on the continent. So I think the free trade agreement will also have a huge part to play in that potential movement.
In terms of the movement of your products, I mean, you grow products on the continent. You also process products, and you also bring in agricultural products. But what's the movement of products regionally or cross border within the continent? Is it a substantive part of your business, or you operate more on a sort of countrywide basis and bilaterally between Africa and the world?
I think the business, we've tried to diversify as much as possible. We do a large percentage of our businesses into Africa. As I mentioned, maize is a huge component in the food supply chain in Africa, and ETG is one of the largest white maize traders in the world. And so I think that will remain a key commodity that will be part of this free trade agreement. But alongside that, we have seen huge emphasis on alternative crops that benefit farmers through crop rotation, improving soil health. So pulses are a huge part of that. And we have strong links with India and export a lot of pulses from Africa to India. And I think the free trade agreement presents an opportunity to standardize frameworks that allow exporters easier access to outside markets from Africa. And alongside this, I think it will encourage producers even more to gain access to the commodities, the export markets that they need for their commodities they're growing. It's often discussed that farmers' one of the biggest concerns is access to markets, and the free trade agreement obviously opens this door even wider.
Okay, fantastic. And in terms of the impediments of intra-Africa trade, what has been the main impediment? Would you say it's bureaucracy and administration, or would you say it's infrastructure? And the cost of transport? I think it's a
combination. Yeah, I think it's a combination of many different things. Of course, transport is a huge cost relative to the rest of the world or other large commodity trading countries like the US or Eastern Europe. So of course, a free trade agreement is not the only solution. I think it's a huge part of the solution, but of course, you're going to have to need that investment in infrastructure as well to support the trade framework.
Fantastic. You mentioned a very interesting point there, standardization. I'd like maybe to go back to the commissioner, maybe on the, I don't want to call them the technical issues, but people have spoken about rules of origin, for example. Here we're talking about standardization of paperwork and processes. And it's very important because ultimately, once you have that standardization, then you can export not only within the continent, but also access external markets. So you become a global player. So can you tell us a little bit about those I suppose benefits, and also some of the things that you're working on in terms of standardization, and also explain to us a little bit more about the rules of origin. You're on mute, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Well, before I answer that question, I think one of the questions which came up on the screen is a very important issue of free movement of people. As part of the agreement, we have a protocol on free movement of people, right of establishment, and right of residence. So that protocol is both under signature and ratification. It requires a minimum of 15 ratifications to enter into force. I think now we have somewhere between 4 and 5 countries that have ratified, so it's a work in progress. But at the end of the day, we'd like to see a situation where it will be possible for Africans to be able to move across the continent freely, and also facilitate mutual recognition of professional and academic qualifications, in addition to having the right to reside in any country or set up a business in the other country. And the driver to this will be the high rate of economic growth and development. Because if there's a slow economic growth, communities tend to be nationalistic. But if there's a high rate of economic growth, there's demand for labor. And so those restrictions tend to be more or less relaxed. Now, of course, for trade to take place, you need to ensure that it's very predictable and fair. And one of the key instruments is the regime on the rules of origin. A greater part of work has been done. I think about 85% of the negotiations have been finalized on the rule of origin. Only 15% remain. But with that, that has been done, it's possible to start trading across the region. So then related to that is customs documentation. Like I indicated earlier on, our new secretariat in Accra, Ghana is working with the customs administrations to ensure that we facilitate very, very, very effective movement of paperwork so that it does not impede trade in any way. So that is a part of the regime. But going beyond that is the issue of quality infrastructure, which really defines the quality of the products that are being traded. So we're in the process of coming up with the African quality policy, which hopefully this year is going to be adopted by the ministers, Then in February next year, the heads of state and government are going to adopt it. We finalize the work at our level. It's just a question of the ministers pronouncing themselves on it. When that has been adopted, then it will be put in a position where we start work on developing a made in Africa standard. So companies that qualify under that standard will be able to label their products as made in Africa. And when that is done, it's going to remove technical barriers to trade. And of course, it's going to promote an environment where people are very confident that they are purchasing safe and high quality products. So this is the work we are doing. Thank you.
Fantastic. So in terms of the rules of origin, sorry, just to come back to that, because I think it's very important ultimately in terms of countries being confident to open up their borders to make sure that there's a fair playing field and that their local industry is not threatened by cheap imports being dumped in one country and flowing freely into another. But the rules of origin, is that more or less finalized, or what are the timeframes on that? I know it's a very protracted and complicated discussion, and one where the devil is in the detail, so it cannot be rushed, or otherwise it can be a cause for frustration and also failure in countries closing their borders. So we want to get it absolutely right from the outset. So how are those negotiations coming along?
Well, like I indicated, I said almost 85% of the work has been done. And you are absolutely right. Because you see, when you open a market, like we are doing under the African Continental Free Trade Area, it's very, very possible that third parties can just bring in their products, which is the transshipment, and take advantage of the market without producing anything on the continent. So the issue of local content is part of the questions that being discussed and is being looked at on a product by product basis to ensure that there are no leakages of transshipments. So very protracted, but only a few sectors remain. And like I indicated earlier, almost 80 to 90% of the work has been done.
Okay, so you're thinking that by the end of this year, this will be
by June this year, they should be able to finish.
Okay, great. Okay, that's strong developments. So maybe I'll go back to Emma. You're speaking to investors on a daily basis. You've traveled to more African countries than most. So I don't want to say advice, but in terms of being able to attract more FDI, are there any particular insights or comments that from the market that you can relay to us?
I'll give it a go. I think the overwhelming message around investment is that this isn't just a competition to get investment into Africa. This is a competition globally, and as we heard from Razia, earlier in the discussion, this last year has seen some, if I'm being polite, it's become a highly competitive environment, but we have seen capital flowing wildly into different locations. So I think where you've got corporate investors making decisions about where they're going to invest, where they're going to build their next factory or office space. This isn't just, is it going to be South Africa or Kenya or Senegal? Is it going to be Vietnam or Mexico? Or, so this is a global competition. And I think where you've got this actually really impressive progress with the Continental Free Trade Area, that really helps to prick up the ears of corporate and institutional investors to recognize that there is something really exciting happening on the African continent. And I think we should give all of our support to the African Union, the Secretariat, to His Excellency in supporting the fast progress of this. I mean, just to give you a sense of sort of perspective from the UK, we've spent the last 4 years or so looking to transition our free trade agreements that we've had as a member of the European Union into bilateral agreements, with obviously the 1st of January is a very, very tight, hard deadline for that. And it's difficult stuff, and that's just transitioning existing agreements. So the idea of getting so many governments to willingly sign up to reduce tariffs, to address regulatory differences, to bring single windows into borders, to bring digitization in, to improve the ability for us to move products and people across borders. This is huge stuff, and I think we should really commend the team involved for making such swift progress, whilst also recognizing that the politics and the will gets harder from here across the board. But look, I think what investors are looking for is certainty, clarity, transparency. And where we can do that at a national level or an international level, that is all to the good. So that's the kind of thing that I think I hear investors talking about. It's the kind of thing I'm talking to governments about. How do you actually create policy consistency, transparency, and consultation around when you're changing regulations, changing legislation, to understand the impact, unintended consequences and intended consequences of any changes, and how business internationally and domestically will be affected by those changes. I think there's also some fantastic opportunities in Africa where we see, we've talked a little bit about the need for economic recovery. There's an amazing opportunity really to bring innovation into this space, to really drive green growth, more resilient economies, greener, more sustainable infrastructure, and do that, as well as using technology. So using technology at the borders, using technology so that actually it's really easy for trucks and people to cross those national borders, that we don't have to train thousands and thousands of customs officials in every minutiae of the differences in different products and different tariffs, because we can digitize it all and make that faster, cheaper, clearer, more consistent in its application for businesses. The other thing that I can see coming up in some of the chats is around inclusion. And I think we talk a lot about infrastructure, thinking about physical infrastructure. We're talking about ports and airports and roads. How do you get economic corridors? How do you build those? How do you get product to market? And that sort of thing. But I think there's also a question around sort of the finances of all of this. How do you help people sell across borders in different currencies? How do you bring more people into the financial sector through financial inclusion? And technology, I think, lies at the heart of that as well. And we're seeing some really exciting innovations happening in that space. But again, crucially, it kind of relies on regulation to enable the changes, the innovations, the entrepreneurs to really drive forward the changes that I think all traders, formal and informal, want to see.
Fantastic. You've raised numerous points. You've also gone through the chat for me, so that's very helpful. And I'm going to get back to the Commission in a few minutes about some of the points that you make, especially cross-border payments. And the role of central banks and the work that the AU has done with the with Afri-Exim Bank. But first of all, I'd like to go to David and just be quite specific in terms of again fears and hopes and opportunities. But focusing on the hopes and opportunities, what are the sectors that that you feel will benefit from the AFCFTA? I mentioned pharmaceuticals, health and life sciences, healthcare and life sciences. So, but I just wanted your outlook in terms of you as a cross-border businessman and an influential lawyer in Ghana.
I like to break down the opportunity areas into three, actually. The first set of opportunity areas, which previous panelists have talked about relate to the bigger mega areas, transportation and connectivity, infrastructure in general, where African Development Bank, for example, estimates that you need $170 billion per annum over the next 10 to 15 years in order to fill that infrastructure gap, where public-private partnerships will be able to deal with things like Djibouti to Dakar Railway or Cape Town to Cairo Road, projects like that. And in that same category, you are looking at cheap power projects which enable electricity to be delivered for value addition at the tariff that makes their products competitive. Because no matter how much you remove the tariffs, if the cost of input is such that the product is still not competitive, then imports will still, and if you take electricity is a very major factor. I mean, it ranges between 13 cents per kilowatt hour to about 32 cents per kilowatt hour across the continent. You definitely want to compete with the likes of Asian tigers, and you are looking at 4 cents per kilowatt hour. How we bring that down becomes another, then all the categories of connectivity and tariff barriers. So that's one set. But the other set, which I think is much easier that we can focus on now, has to do with the categories of very simple things like feeding the people, fast-moving consumer goods, urban food demands is growing exponentially across Africa, currently estimated at $35 billion per annum. And the projection is to grow at $110 billion per annum by 2025 and up to $150 billion by 2030. A lot of this local food consumption will drive agri-sector production also. And those are things we can focus on now. And then it leads to funding in smallholder farming, a lot of cross-border lending. So I see that area growing. The other area I see growing is clothing. Suddenly, if you have a continent of 1.3 billion people, and you can easily export clothes across the continent, and which is happening to some extent, it creates a huge market. Housing in terms of Africa's mega cities and a lot of movements happening, moving the people in our post-sea era. I don't want to mention the full, and then value addition in very light industries and light manufacturing areas are going to grow because of the whole idea of improving standards and the opportunities that the rules of origin creates for us to be able to export to larger markets. And then, of course, I should say that the areas of growth cuts across many other areas. I've mentioned agri-sector, even education, creative arts, and finance. So I think it is simply a question of looking at how to position one's industry, and to land on that, we should not forget services. The first set of services, if my understanding is right, I think His Excellency can confirm that, that is going to be added includes transportation, construction, business support services, the financial sector. These are going to change the scenario within which we operate. And I think these are sectors that are all potential areas of growth.
Fantastic. So, Commissioner, there you got one question on services, and also my question in terms of cross-border payments. I know that the Afrexim Bank is putting together a cross-border payment settlement platform. So if you can give us an update on cross-border payments in local currency. You're on mute, sir.
Yes, I always forgot. Like indicated, we are working with the African Export-Import Bank to facilitate speed payments and the settlements across the continent. So what has been designed is what is going to be called the Pan-African Payments and the Settlement System, PAPS, as it is called. And the Association of Central Banks and the Ministries of Finance are going to come up with a policy framework or regulatory framework for facilitating payments and settlements across the region. And when right now the work is underway to have a pilot phase in West Africa to see how it works out. And if it's successful, then it's going to be rolled out to the rest of Africa. The idea is to have a situation where there are everyday settlements in local currency. Then at an agreed period of time, that's when they are going to be net settlements in the foreign exchange. And that is going to really greatly facilitate trade across the region. Services is very key into the African Continental Free Trade Area. And for that reason, we have two immediate protocols which were negotiated. The first one was the protocol on the trade in goods, and then the protocol on the trade in services. And building on that, a number of priority sectors were identified to facilitate trade in services. Those have been mentioned. I think the only one which was not mentioned is tourism. So we've got 5 priority sectors, and more are going to be added as we go along, because there's a huge scope for really promoting intra-African trade in services. Just to give an example, within the transport sector, we also have what we call the single African air transport market. When that is in operation, it is going to make it possible for any African airline to establish anywhere in Africa and fly to any part of Africa. And that is a huge scope really for increasing intra-African trade. So it's a huge, is a component part of it. Now, the issue of inclusivity also came up, and one can also look at it at the continental level in the context of facilitating win-win outcomes in the intra-African trade. A number of initiatives are being designed for that. One of them is to come up with the African Continental Free Trade Area Adjustment Facility, where it will be possible for countries or even businesses to borrow so that they are able to meet the competition that is emerging by participating in the intra-African trade. As a transition, the African Export-Import Bank has made a provision of $1 billion, and the interested countries can go and borrow at agreed terms and conditions to use that facility, but on a long-term basis. And this is one of the issues under discussion right now. I was talking in Accra, Ghana, by the senior trade officials. There's going to be, they are developing statutes, which is going to really create a larger institution called the African Adjustment Facilities, which will define the capital, the level of the money to be put in, how it is going to be used, and also how to subscribe and other issues. And we hope that that draft statute can go to the summit in February 2022. Then at the level of production, we've been working with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, to come up with the regional value chain mapping exercise across Africa, so that we are able to know what each and every country is able to really produce across Africa, either as a finished product or as an intermediate product. Intermediate products are very key in also in promoting intra-African trade. And when we have that, then it will be possible really for countries using those results to undertake investment promotion activities, so that some of the companies can establish in their territories and export to the rest of the region. Thank you.
So a very quick question, Commissioner. When do you expect the AFCFTA to contribute considerably to Africa's GDP growth? And what are you thinking it's going to contribute? 1, 2, 3 percentage points a year extra?
Well, it's very difficult, but the scope is very, very huge. We had a study which was done by the World Bank last year. If my memory serves me right, we're always making speeches, so it's very difficult to remember all the statistics. But I think the outcome of that study is that in the next 10 years or so, if we implement the agreement effectively,
And in terms of starting to reap the benefits, you're saying it's from when? It will be once the rules of origins have been finalized. So around June, that we'll start seeing more trade flows as thanks to the AfCFTA, and therefore impact from the AfCFTA.
Well, we have developed what we call the African Trade Observatory, which is going to really assist us in generating information about the trade flows across Africa. So we'll be using that observatory to generate that information. But like I indicated earlier, trade can start with the already agreed upon rules of origin. Then when the others emerge, that will only expand the scope for trading. So as the trading is underway, it started in June this year. The key task is to be able to collect the statistics and get informed on how the trading is going on. So I think by January 2022, we should be able to have generated the good statistics to indicate whether we are moving in the right direction or the momentum is very low. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Okay, no, so absolutely. Given that 85% of the agreements are in place, there's no reason why we should wait till everything is finalized before moving ahead with those 85% or the 85% of the products out there. So I'll come to Giles actually. I mean, food for me is actually a massive opportunity. Obviously, David mentioned some of the big enablers. So transport, connectivity, infrastructure, and power. But ultimately, food is where there's a big food import bill, and there's massive internal consumption. So agri is definitely the sector I would be looking at eagerly. But tell me, in terms of working with the SMEs, because there's a lot of questions around SMEs ultimately, in terms of the AfCFTA is not for the 1%, it's for the 99%. So working with SMEs, can you tell us a little bit about how your organization works with SMEs and the scope for growth there?
Yeah, of course. I've seen in the comments as well, you know, a large proportion of traders are obviously individuals, and a lot of them are women as well. So I think, you know, as an organization, of course, we're dealing with smallholder farmers and individual traders at borders, tens of thousands of them, you know, across the continent and the 30 countries we operate in. And of course, they're a huge part of our business and a huge part of the supply chain. And this free trade agreement will affect them as much as it will everyone else. So it's definitely, you know, we cannot forget the importance of that ground reality. So of course, we'll do everything we can as an organization to pass on the benefits to our clients and customers. And you know, we value all of these people immensely in our business. So yeah, I think it's definitely not it's something you can't forget.
Okay, fantastic. And has that developed in terms of developing that value chain in agriculture in terms of your particular business? So creation of those cooperatives, working more closely with those local suppliers and local farmers, developing that local content capacity.
Yeah, I think, the transition of agriculture into large commercial agriculture does not happen overnight. And we understand that. I think perhaps some agricultural businesses in Africa do not. Yeah, I think, the development of cooperatives, aggregation, investment in infrastructure at farmer gate level, these are all things that we're doing because we understand the huge amount of value that both smallholders provide to the supply chain, but also what we can provide to the smallholders in order to give them the tools to grow bigger businesses, get access to cheaper capital, and essentially grow their own business.
Fantastic. Look, we've got approximately 3 or 4 minutes to go, so maybe we'll go to David, and what are your milestones ultimately in terms of what would you like to see in terms of milestones from the FCFTA in the next year or so, David?
One, I would like to see countries quickly realign their legal framework and policy framework with the AFCFTA to take advantage individually. Secondly, I would like to see countries cooperate to make the AFCFTA possible. A particular example is that of transportation. We always talk about cross-border, singular transport market, etc. But there is one part we overlook. That's the maritime. 97% of world trade is moved by sea. And if you want to export pineapple from Ghana or Nigeria, for example, to Cameroon, it will cost you $1.50 per ton because it goes to Europe and comes back. Whereas if you were sending it directly to Europe, it costs you 90 cents. So it's actually cheaper to export to Europe in terms of the cargo cost than to export to a neighboring African country. It's because you don't have liner vessels in Africa, and we need to develop the like of system you have in Dover, in Europe, etc. So cooperation is 2. 3, I would like to see a conscious promotion of export trading companies like the like of ETG that girls work with, so that they are consciously improving both intra-Africa trade in terms of new opportunities and Africa's trade with the rest of the world as well, because our trade with the rest of the world is also quite low. And lastly, I would like to see a conscious effort on the part of both business associations and governments to change the traditional thinking of people that this is not doable, so we can take advantage of it.
Fantastic. Emma, if we can go to you in terms of your critical milestones for 2021 and how you intend on engaging on the African continent with businesses and UK investors into the continent as well.
Well, I think we've got an awful lot of work to do. As Dr. Adesina from the African Development Bank told me in our conference last week, there's a huge opportunity in Africa, and we really want to see UK companies leaning into those opportunities. Key aspect for me is around making sure that we continue to promote what is happening in Africa to the UK business community, that we are working hand in glove with the Secretariat for the Continental Free Trade Area to advertise, to promote, to raise awareness about the opportunities that the progress here will make, and added to which, really increasing awareness about the opportunities that currently exist as well at a bilateral level. So as we've transitioned our trade agreements, how do we get greater utilization of those? And I think the muscle memory around that will be really helpful as we see the transition to a continental-wide approach. So I think there's a huge amount to do for this year, as always. But I think as we see as we move towards the end of the year and we see COP26, which the UK is due to be hosting, a really strong push around green growth, around green economy, clean growth. How do we promote renewables as a cheaper, cleaner, more sustainable way to provide energy to the hundreds of thousands, millions of Africans that don't yet have access to that energy, to help drive the business growth that we want to see happening as a result of the continental free trade area coming into its own. So I think there's all sorts of stuff going on. It's going to be a really busy year, and on top of all of that, of course, we are all going to be continuing to see how do we continue to flex and adapt to what the world throws at us in terms of the pandemic and anything else.
Fantastic. I'd just like to add one thing to what you said. I mean, you spoke about COP26 and you spoke about greener growth earlier on and green energy. And people talk about a lot about ESG, so environment, social and governance criteria. And I was speaking to an investment banker last week who said that, ESG is core to most African investments in any case. I mean, they were raising capital for an oil and gas company 6 or 7 years ago. And within the prospectus, there was talk about how do you work with the community? How do you make sure that the community benefits? How do you make sure that the community isn't adversely affected by any pollution, leaks or whatever in terms of their oil and gas projects? So ESG is very core ultimately in terms of projects in Africa, and hopefully there's a large pool of capital that we can tap into on that front. Giles, I'll come to you very quickly for. You've had a relatively good year. I mean, foods performed well in general last year, but what are your main economic and business challenges that you foresee for this year, and what are you working towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been lucky to be involved in the food sector, which of course is one of the top priorities in terms of allowing people to move and get to work in order to get food on our plates. And I think coupled with this huge rally in global commodity prices, I think it is a hugely interesting year for the industry and for Africa. So I think, the potential challenges going ahead are going to be around food security, government intervention into markets. In Africa, we do often see quite a lot of intervention around protectionist policies, which can be detrimental to private sector in certain instances. And of course, business travel. We're in an industry, and business in general is hugely dependent on relationships. And as much as we've adapted to technology, I think we are coming to realize the importance and the value of a face-to-face conversation. And again, that's going to be an ongoing, unresolved problem over the next 12 months, I'm sure. But of course, we're looking forward to the future, and hopefully, for Africa, with the free trade agreement on the horizon, there's huge opportunity ahead.
Fantastic. Commissioner, before I pass it on to William for his closing remarks, maybe we close with you. Would you say that you're satisfied with progress and the political will is still as strong as it was 3 years ago?
The political will is very, very, very strong. And this has been demonstrated by the number of ratifications that are going on. And I think very soon we are going to have close to 40 ratifications, which means that we are moving in the right direction. And just this morning, I featured with the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of International Cooperation and International Relations of Namibia, where she formally launched the Namibian Sadiq African Union National Committee, which means that countries are taking steps to align their national policies to those of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we are moving in the right direction, and we also trying to expand the number of developmental and transformational leaders. For financial institutions, we have the President of Ghana. And going forward, if I'm re-elected, next month we're going to have elections. One of my priority areas would be to have a champion and leader on inclusive sustainable industrialization, a champion and leader on the digital and the circular economies, a champion and leader on the sustainable tourism and others, so that we involve the leaders in all this. And all these activities are complementary to the work which our colleagues are doing in Accra, Ghana, which is to deepen in the market and expand it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your contribution, Your Excellency. Thank you to all my fellow panelists, Honorable Emma Wade-Smith, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Africa. Razia Khan had to leave us, Head of Research at Standard Chartered Bank. David Oposo-Dorte, founder, AB and David Africa, and true Pan-Africanist and a champion of Africa as well as being an Afro champion. And Giles Lewis, Head of Grains and Oilseed at the Export Trading Group, who are doing some fantastic work in agriculture across the continent, truly Pan-African company. William, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, everybody. I think you've benefited from an incredible session there and brilliantly moderated, Omar, if I may say, but with fantastic speakers. And yes, there are challenges, and I think we've heard some really insightful remarks on the realities on the ground, and there's still a lot to be done about educating the benefits of the free trade agreement, particularly to the SME community, which is where we're focused as an organization. But I think the headline message for me has been, put aside all the challenges, they're always going to exist. Actually, massive progress has already been made, and you look at what's been achieved around standardization and the rules of origin and the vision for the Made in Africa stamp that His Excellency outlined. And it proves that these challenges can and will be overcome. And frankly, the last year has proven that when we come together, remarkable things can be achieved. Things that people thought were never possible, like vaccines that should take 10 years, take 1 year. So if that can be done, this can be done. And in many respects, the challenges that are there, be they the infrastructure isn't in place needed to make the free trade agreement truly succeed, those are opportunities, because infrastructure is not going to build itself. It requires investment, and even more reason now to invest into the infrastructure and to the fabrics and to the healthcare and the agricultural sectors that we've heard so much about, that are all positioned for real growth. Not just talking about it, but you can see now structurally how that could happen with the free trade agreement implemented. So I think that for me, that was the headline message. Yes, it's going to take time. Yes, there are challenges, but this can sit beneath everything else as a huge opportunity and a platform for growth. And I think most excitingly, at a time when many regional trade blocs are perhaps looking inwards, or people like the UK are leaving them, other trade blocs may not be working as well as they could be. Here's an opportunity for Africa to lead on the global stage, and to make a statement and say regional trade and domestic trade can and will be a great success story, and to put a positive narrative out about Africa at a time when there's not much positive news around. So let's embrace it. Let's make the most of it. Thank you all for your participation. Lots of questions came in that we weren't able to get to, but we will be making a recording available of the whole session. If you follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, that's Invest in Africa, you'll be the first to get it, and we'll be sending it out to everyone who registered as well. But make sure you follow us on those social media channels, Invest in Africa, and we'll get you all the relevant content. Thank you to everybody who took part. Special thanks to our panel. You were brilliant. And thank you to Omar for moderating and guiding us through this incredibly complicated but exciting topic so expertly once again. Wish you all a very good week ahead and a successful 2021. And I hope we can come together soon to celebrate some of these milestones we've been talking about today. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, William.
Thank you for putting
it together.